Now, I really think that biodynamics is broader than just preparations. It could be an expression of love of the land, basically, and the land's ability to bring people together. Read up about it, meet some other growers, get some 500 in your hands and smell it and squeeze it and try to just get a feel for it and put it out in your garden and see if you notice any difference. And small steps, just have a go rather than being too sceptical.
Welcome to this podcast series, Biodynamic Farmers and Gardeners in Australia. The series was commissioned by Biodynamic Agriculture Australia Limited and produced by Householders Options to Protect the Environment, Hope Incorporated Australia. Biodynamic Agriculture Australia Limited is a not-for-profit company located in Bellingen, New South Wales. It has been making and supplying biodynamic preparations as well as supporting biodynamic growing in Australia for over 30 years. Biodynamic Agriculture Australia Limited values biodynamics as a practical and holistic technique that is able to regenerate soil, supercharge organic growing, restore biodiversity, and work with Mother Nature. The podcast series was produced on and adjacent to the traditional lands of the Djarrawa, Gayabal, Yugara and Waka Waka First Nations peoples of the surrounding region. We pay respect to the past, present and emerging leaders of all First Nation Australians in this country and celebrate the unique contributions their cultures make to this place. And in the context of this podcast series, particularly those contributions involving Indigenous respect for and stewardship of the nature of Australia, with its attendant spiritual and practical care for country, the sovereignty of which was never ceded. Hello, my name is Andrew Nicholson, and I am the producer of the Biodynamic Farmers and Gardeners in Australia podcast series. My guest on this episode of the series is Sam Statham, who grows wine grapes, olive and fig trees on his farm Rosnay, located near to the town of Canowindra in the central west of New South Wales. This is also the home of Sam's family, his wife Simone, and their three children, Molly, Georgie and Floyd. Sam himself grew up with his two brothers on a family farm in New South Wales, which he describes as a bush paradise of rough, hilly country, mostly non-arable and often drought declared. During a life-changing trip around New Zealand in the 1990s, Sam visited biodynamic farms there and took that biodynamic experience back into the family farm. Over the last 20 years or so, Sam and his own family have continued to develop their farm using organic and biodynamic practices, as well as turning it into a community title subdivision, with multiple growers working together under an organic covenant. A written account of Sam's biodynamic growing experiences is also contained in an associated profile booklet of all the guests interviewed for this podcast series, entitled Stories of Our Biodynamic Farmers and Gardeners in Australia. Please see Biodynamic Agriculture Australia Limited's website for further details of that publication. Sam, a very warm welcome to you. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
Thanks, Andrew. It's really great to be here, and I'm looking forward to it as well.
So let's start our discussion about your journey into biodynamic growing and the work on your farm through a fuller self-introduction. So can you give us an outline of your work on Rosnay Farm and give us a bit of a mini profile of its location and main characteristics?
Yeah, great, Andrew. Yeah, well, look, we've been farming here at Rosnay since 1997 on a block that's was originally 140 hectares and now it's about 32 hectares at 8 kilometres southwest of Canowindra on the south bank of the Blubula River. About 10 kilometres upstream from where it joins the Lachlan River at Goolagong. So our farm is part of a community title farm, as you mentioned. It's Rivers Road Organic Farms. That's a fantastic structure that we're part of, and we can talk about that a bit more later. But yeah, basically our farm, we grow olives and figs and wine grapes on these beautiful red clay soils that slope down north to the Blubula River, and we've got beautiful views up to Mount Canobolas and Orange, 65 kilometres north of us. And those soils are just fantastic with high water holding capacity, very good fertility and good for growing things like olives and grapes. And Yeah, there's been some rough history there on that farm, of course. Over the 70s and 80s, it was continuously cropped, and there was erosion as a result of that. And we've been just basically regenerating and trying to bring it back from there. And now the soils are fantastic, and that's partly because of biodynamics.
What a lovely pen picture of the property and the surrounding landscapes, and also picking up on that, in a sense, inadvertent experiment of the fact that your property was a conventional industrial farmed property before you got there. And so there's almost that before and after aspect to this in terms of the beneficial effects of biodynamics, as you just implied. So thanks for that. And just to carry on that sort of thread that we've been looking at, and particularly for listeners new to biodynamic ideas or those keen to gain further knowledge, what about this question? From your perspective, Sam, in 2023, how would you describe biodynamics? What are some of the basic principles and benefits of biodynamic methods as they apply to your type of wine, grape, olive, and fig growing?
Great question. It's pretty hard to answer, and my answer to that has probably been evolving over the last 25 years, to the point where now I really think that biodynamics is broader than just preparations. It could be an expression of love of the land, basically, and the land's ability to bring people together. So when you read Steiner's agriculture lectures, you get great ideas that you can build on your farm, and essentially the preparations is the main tool with which a farmer can, give the land his love, positive intent, and become part of the farm. So I really don't think there's a conflict between the very different perspectives on the spectrum of biodynamics, from your traditional sort of authentic, mainly physical approaches using the preparations themselves, to people I've seen using radionics and field broadcasters to do very similar things, or even your more indigenous approach where you sort of have a communion with like the boss animals like kangaroos, and sort of ask for guidance and just pay respect for the land. So it's to me it's very broad.
I've heard this from other guests in the series. As listeners go through these interviews, they will hear this also, that there's a spectrum of approaches, methods and practices, call them what you will, as there would be after 100 years or so of biodynamic theory, evolution and practice development. But some very strong elements that have come out in general terms from those other interviewees are things like love of the land, bringing community together, that social aspect of biodynamics and regenerative growing practices. And so, in a sense, we're coming up to this next question here. As you said, that property you're on now has been farmed in a different way. So let's just take a comparative question to dig into that in a bit more depth. How would you say your work differs from conventional growing? You started to answer this question, but how, for instance, might your produce differ from what people find in their local supermarket, say?
There's a whole spectrum of ways that farming differs, and I'd say at one end of the spectrum you've got the high input, highly controlled, scientific or materialist scientific approach to agriculture, where everything can be standardized, and I think it doesn't really reflect a real view of reality. But that's your mainstream conventional GMO style agriculture, which I guess you do see in the supermarkets, especially now with the labelling of GMOs not being very good. But basically that goes through a spectrum where you've then got your more low input conventional farmers, which I guess we were up at Barraba, back in the 80s, through to your organic farming, regenerative farming, and biodynamic farming, where you're kind of working with the situation rather than trying to totally control the situation. It's sort of like you're becoming more flexible and holistic in your view of production. So you're sort of, in a way, you're just manipulating an ecosystem and trying to extract some surplus product, a crop or or a fibre from that ecosystem. So it's kind of, yeah. Sorry, that's a really long answer, but it's we'd probably be 3/4 of the way along that spectrum. I mean, our farm is a horticulture operation where we've got plots of certain things, vines or olives, and then we've planted as much as we can of like native species around the outside and biodiversity areas, and those biodiversity areas are required in the organic farming system. But we also see a lot of benefits from those in our production areas. So anyway, there you go. There's a bit of an outline.
So, Sam, I think we're hearing here about a sort of continuum, a range, as you might expect in the real world, where one size does not fit all. There are lots of different approaches to agriculture and farming practices. But again, that biodynamic, organic, permaculture, regenerative approach down, let's say, one end of that continuum on the right-hand side, let's say, you've just mentioned some features of that, working with nature, ecosystem protection, soil biology enhancement, cover crops. And then at the other end of the continuum, let's say the left-hand end of the continuum or range or spectrum, perhaps a more dominating of nature type model where you have major chemical inputs going in and other major impacts onto the soil's health in terms of cropping. And I just wonder out loud whether we might be moving, hopefully we are, from left to right, in a sense, on that continuum. For instance, I've heard that regenerative agriculture generally is being taken up more widely. It's on the increase in Australia. But anyway, I suppose that remains to be seen. But coming back to the interview here, we've been dodging around in the modern era in 2023. So now let's go back in time a bit here, because I think it's always interesting to hear about the human interest story behind the innovative people like you who are helping progress new ways of doing things, in your case, regenerative and biodynamic agriculture approaches. So let's get to that question. How did you first become involved with biodynamic growing? Looking back in time, how did you first get involved? For instance, did you gradually get into it? Were there light bulb moments? Were there early influential mentors? And what resources did you tap into to build up your knowledge and expertise?
I grew up on a farm up northern New South Wales where we had very extensive agriculture, so it was kind of organic by default in many ways. I do remember the smell of Roundup though, and Dad used to dip sheep and stuff like that. But my grandfather was right into organic gardening. He was actually a doctor, and he had books about Rudolf Steiner, interestingly enough, on his bookshelf. And it was actually after he passed away that I sort of went in there and nicked a couple of books, and read this one book in particular by John Soper about biodynamic gardening in South Africa. And I happened to be on a boat going over to New Zealand, sort of in between university and embarking on my sort of career path. And to me, it was a bit of a revelation. It was quite a sudden shift in my way of looking at farming. And so basically, I was fairly skeptical initially, and just happened to run into a guy in a pub in New Zealand, and he just said to me, "Don't knock it until you've seen it," because he's got mates up the road who are doing it. So I actually went up and worked on this farm with Ian and Gita Henderson, just near Christchurch, and then just the journey started from there. I went working on other farms and herb production communities, Steiner communities and things in New Zealand, and it was just a huge eye opener. And basically came back to Australia inspired.
Always interesting to hear, how individual guests got from A to Z, or that they're still moving towards Z on their journey of professional discovery. That early reading sort of piquing your interest, and then getting involved with people who are actually doing this stuff, the biodynamic work on the land, getting sort of enthused with that, and then bringing that influence back into your own farming practice, your family's farming practice in Australia. So let's stay with that biodynamic focus and come back into the present moment and tell us a bit more. You've started to tell us about this, but tell us a bit more about those biodynamic techniques that you're using on your farm now, and specifically, what do you reckon are the beneficial impacts they've had on the landscape there, the soils, the animals, the plants on your property? And also, I gather, what beneficial impacts they've had on you personally. Has becoming a biodynamic grower changed you personally in any way? So there's a two-part question there. First of all, the improvements on the property, also then the improvements possibly to yourself and your own lifestyle.
Well, I guess, started out using biodynamics as part of a shotgun approach. Like, we used a lot of different things to try to bring our farm back from the new farm down here at Canowindra, to bring it back to life, and we use biodynamics as part of that. So compost and biodynamic preparations, but also a lot of other things like lime and crushed basalt dust, gypsum or rock phosphate, worm juice, fish fertilizer, seaweed, deep ripping. A whole lot of things which, combined with biodynamics, did bring it back to life over the next 5 years or so. And the question of whether of what role biodynamics played in that is, it's not something I can answer with a scientific hat on. But my gut feeling is it's definitely helped. From a simplistic view of it, a bit like putting a culture into a cheese. Spreading the horn manure, you're actually just simply spreading lots of beneficial microbes that have been in oxygenated water and energised with rhythmic stirring, and basically putting the influence or the actual bacteria and fungi out onto your land. So to me, it's logical, and the benefits are there. You can see the massive change in the structure of the soil now, from the powdery or either powdery or concrete soil. So you'd have what they call Sunday soils here. The eroded and worn out soil is, what happens is it rains on Friday, it's too wet to plough it or even do anything on Saturday. You get a brief window where you can maybe do some cultivation on Sunday, and then it's set back into concrete and powder if you try to do anything on the Monday. So that's why they call them Sunday soils. But now, the soil's crumbly. There's like this topsoil is just made of fine little balls of worm cast. Totally what they call structured topsoil, and the roots of the plants are going down deep into the subsoil, and the whole thing is not anymore. It's no longer sort of repellent to rain. Like when the rain hits, the soil soaks it in like a sponge. So you can see the benefit of using those practices. And we have done a certain amount of measurement of organic matter increases, and from 0.25% to 2% or whatever. It sort of depends on the situation. But yeah, there's certainly been huge benefits from using those organic and biodynamic practices. But one of the interesting things that I saw in New Zealand was Ian Henderson's stirring machine, and because I'd only just been reading about it, and I'm just thinking, oh wow, this is amazing. But I had a very simplistic, sort of naive point of view about it, and I said to him, aren't you supposed to be stirring these preparations by hand instead of using machine? Because in the book I read, you're supposed to be stirring it by hand, and this is where it gets to be cosmic, because you're putting your intention into the preparation. So you're actually physically stirring a bucket or a barrel of water with the horn manure, which is the manure that you put in a cow horn and fermented or slowly changed over the period of 6 months in winter. And when you get it out, it's teeming with microbes, and you're mixing that in water, but you're actually thinking about it, and you're focusing on improving your farm and improving the soil. And it's almost like a meditation or a form of prayer or whatever. So that's what they call intention. And I'm like, you can't do that with a machine. And then his answer sort of was interesting. He said, even though I'm doing it with a machine, I made that machine, and I made it with my intention to do this, and now it's helping me to spread my intention over my farm. And that's sort of like where you go into this spectrum of biodynamics, where you've actually got all sorts of possibilities, where it opens up, and then obviously there's a lot of debate and disagreement about this, but that was a real eye opener. And although we haven't built a field broadcaster on our farm, it's something I do want to do eventually, and I totally respect people who are doing it, and they've seen the results on their own farms. So that's where it kind of becomes very cosmic and bigger than us. But I'm sure a lot of things are out there, and we're just not open to them.
And Sam, just coming back to that rather long and convoluted question I asked you in the first place, which was also on the personal side of biodynamics. I know there's been some beneficial impacts that you've experienced in your own life and lifestyle down there. Can you give us some insight into those?
Biodynamics has changed me for sure. It's become part of a wider journey. But basically, the idea of the farm as a self-reliant organism makes you look at things differently. So you're always trying to find solutions to problems from things that are already there. And, you're recycling everything as much as possible, kind of like you're encouraging that farm ecosystem and the whole cycling of stuff. So even farm buildings, renovations and other stuff that we build out of just materials from what we call the back fence line materials depot. It's just, stuff that's been put aside and eventually finds a use. And yeah, but I know mentally, the spiritual side of biodynamics and the idea of a world, that's cloaked in etheric energy or whatever you want to call it, can lead you down rabbit holes. And, sometimes it can be hard to reconcile that spiritual stuff with everyday life. But I do like the idea that it comes down to just positive intention and putting your doing your best you can for your land. And I think I've benefited so much just physically and mentally from having the opportunity to do that. I feel very lucky to have been able to work with a farm like this and improve it and recreate a bit of an ecosystem. And it's been good for my health, having a physical job like this, as well as mentally, to also be able to be creative and do things like this, interviews and whatever. I mean, it's all part of that creative and spreading the word. And when people actually buy the product, you just feel really proud that people appreciate it. And it's just, I guess that's the final thing is that your customers are the ones who are actually keeping the boat afloat, keeping the whole idea alive. And it's fantastic.
It certainly sounds inspiring, and you can just feel some of the positive energy there as you're talking about that. That interesting theme of interconnection, I've heard this before across the series, to give it its fancy term, holism, the principle that everything is connected to everything else. And I'm just thinking, although other forms of agriculture might do this as well, it just does seem to be second nature within biodynamics and other forms of regenerative agriculture that you would be looking at stuff like recycling of materials, almost that circular economy approach, as an important intentional focus to the work. And that's another idea, intention, that seems to have emerged throughout the series, the idea of intention that is bringing a close focus to watching what you're doing at all times, exploring the consequences of what you're doing, thinking ahead. So making the biodynamic preparations and putting them out, but also closely observing their effects, then fine-tuning further work in the light of that observation. That intentional approach seems to be a very strong strand within biodynamic practice. And so, Sam, we've been talking here about some bigger picture benefits, for instance, health benefits in the form of superior nutritional quality and superior taste benefits of food that customers experience from well-grown biodynamic produce such as yours. Also, the personal health benefits of physical hands-on work, on the land, such as you described, but almost with that meditative approach coming in as an extra sort of beneficial experience. And so, given this bigger picture viewpoint, it might be a good time to ask one more bigger picture question. And we've already started referring here to Rudolf Steiner. And so this brings us into a more detailed discussion about the spiritual and cosmic interest within overall biodynamic practice and philosophy, because that does go back to the original ideas of Rudolf Steiner in the 1920s. And of course, there has been a lot of water under the bridge since then. And you've been hinting at some of the adaptations to ideas that you came up with, for instance, or you observed, for instance, in terms of that stirring machine in New Zealand, that anecdote you gave us back at the beginning of the interview. So my question here is, what has been your experience of that more spiritual and cosmic aspect of biodynamic working philosophy, and how have you approached adapting those aspects and incorporating them into your growing strategies?
Yeah, so my experience of that spiritual aspect has been a bit of a journey as well, and I mean it's kind of personal, and it's a sort of just a snapshot in time of my current thoughts about it all. But I think Steiner was trying to help people who are in the really materialist sort of worldview to get glimpses into some of the laws of nature that operate on multiple sort of planes of existence, or multiple sort of levels, and some of the laws of nature that we do experience and we see every day, but using substances, or I don't even know if it has to be a substance, but intention, as you mentioned before, to try to use those laws of nature to your advantage. So, it's just kind of, to me, I'm interested in that stuff, but it is hard to use in your everyday physical life. But when you think about it, there's vibration. Everyone knows there's vibration at different levels, and we try to raise our vibration, and that sort of thing in life. If you think about that sort of stuff, you've got the forces of attraction and repulsion. You can feel something in your heart. Something's right, and you're attracted to it. And the ideas of harmony and balance and beauty, and even the rhythms of up and down in our daily energy and motivation. And I mean, even the laws of cause and effect. I mean, every action and even every thought that you have potentially has an effect. So, I mean, it's huge, and it becomes overwhelming to think about the universe in that way. But at the end of the day, when you're out there and you're just stirring some preparations and putting them in the trailer and spraying them on the land, you do ponder those things as you go, and it's all part of that, I don't know, physical meditation. I don't know what it is, but you're sitting in the ute and you're spreading preparation 500, and it just feels right, and it's a real pleasure to do. So they're the sorts of ideas that go through your mind anyway.
So, Sam, really fascinating to hear that there, as with other guests in the series, how you have brought your own particular interpretation and adaptation of Steiner's original ideas, as might not be unsurprising over the course of 100 years, those ideas being adapted. As with other guests in the series, you found your own ways, however, to adapt what we might term pure biodynamic principles in the light of growing realities in 2023, in the 21st century. As a fan of the history of ideas, for me, this is a great example of how ideas can evolve and be adapted over time. Or perhaps that doesn't happen in some cases, regrettably. But look, staying with this idea of adaptation and coming to this as an idea of one way of managing change, that being to adapt to new realities, different ways of doing things in order to meet fresh challenges, for instance. We know that even achieving progressive beneficial change, such as regenerative growing based on biodynamic principles, that rarely happens without some degree of setback or frustration being experienced along the way. So, in your case, Sam, what have been some of your challenges that you've had to overcome or are still working to overcome on Rosnay Farm down there near Canowindra in New South Wales?
Well, there's no shortage of challenges. Apart from the original challenge, which was just this rundown farm and trying to rebuild soil fertility and using a fairly textbook approach to the biodynamic stuff with that, and just the 500 and the compost and that basic challenge. But then there's down the track, there's other challenges waiting for you. There's pests and weeds and diseases that still affect you, and it's kind of a bit easier in a drought, but in those wet years, you face a lot of challenges. We've had starlings was one of the big pests we used to have. Then you have things like snails. Last year it was so wet, we had an infestation with snails. Then you have just generally cool seasons and slow ripening, or you may have powdery mildew and fungal infection of your vines. So they're all challenges that biodynamics does offer some solutions to. Whether or not those solutions always work is another question, and this is where sort of going off road and doing what your intuition tells you to do may or may not be effective. And I've had both, but I think in the early days we just called a friend, and this is 20 years ago. We had a lot to do with Cheryl Kemp, who was the education officer of the Biodynamic Farming and Gardening Association, as it was called back then, and I'd ring her up and just get the actual inside scoop on the ideal time and method of say peppering an insect pest, which was actually, in this case, it was a bird pest, starlings, who actually probably they took about a third of our Chardonnay back in 1999, 2000. I guess the canopy wasn't very big. The vines were still pretty young, and it was also sort of beginning of the drought, and so it was a bit of a dry spell. They were probably just looking for water as well as eating our crops. But basically, they were being a pest, and they were taking it away. And Cheryl just gave me the ideal sort of scenario, and so peppering, for anyone who doesn't know what it is, it's a bit of a weird one, but you take the pest and you reduce it to its lowest common denominator, to its finest white ash. You basically just barbecue it, char it, blowtorch it, whatever you need to do to turn it into ash. So basically we would shoot one starling and cook it on the flame and reduce it down to fine ash, and then you're actually reducing that ash, but you're also potentizing it, which is what they call when you dilute a substance and shake the hell out of it, or energize it and then dilute it again by a factor of 10, and then again and again and again, and the number of times that you dilute becomes the number in front of the X when you sort of name this thing. So it might be a 7X, which would be a bit of starling ash initially diluted in water, and then just slowly rediluted 7 times, right? And that's sort of paradoxically very powerful compared to just a one dilution. But anyway, I mean, sometimes you suspend your disbelief. You're on a learning journey and you just have a go. And I followed Cheryl's instructions, and it was amazing, the result that happened after spraying this diluted ash of a starling over 3 days, when there was Venus in Scorpio. That was the key time that Cheryl identified, and it worked. I mean, I got the neighbours to come out and have a look, and they saw it too. There was starlings which normally fly like a hive, like a hive mind. They sort of, they're amazing to watch, actually. Then there's thousands of them flying like insects, and they all seem to have the same mind. Well, they went from that to being individual birds scattered all over the paddock, up a tree there, or just sitting on the driveway there. And yeah, I could just walk up and pick one up off the ground and it wouldn't fly away. They were kind of groggy, and they certainly weren't flying around in a hive. And that actually got rid of them for the length of time we needed to get rid of them for, so we could harvest a crop of Chardonnay. So I was astounded. But then another time I went and had a go, and I didn't ring Cheryl, and I just looked at a sort of basic, fairly generic calendar and went, oh yeah, that looks a bit like Venus in Scorpio, or that's practical. But then it actually didn't work, and I wasted my time. So there is lessons to be learnt from following experienced advice of others whilst developing your own intuitive confidence, but you're always going to have setbacks and failures along the way. But there's other times more recently when we had snails. That was only last year. The peppering did work, but it only worked for a week. Again, I wish I called Cheryl on that one, but at least they did work for a week, and my wife noticed, and we were like, oh, geez, where'd all those snails go? They just literally just disappeared and then must have gone back into their holes in the ground. But then they were actually devouring our vines last year. It was just such a flood-ridden season, constantly wet. It's like the soil was trying to digest anything growing out of it. But, I mean, in that sort of season, that's where your 501, your horn silica is good, and silica having this magnifying effect on sunlight, and it just assists with the thickening of the walls of the skin of the leaves, and the resistance of plants to mildew, or even that sort of digesting effect of the soil and things like snails and slugs. Or even just the speeding of ripening. So one year we had Merlot that just got stuck; it just wouldn't ripen anymore, and we sprayed the 501, the silica, for 3 days in a row, and the ripeness just jumped away almost too much. So basically the other side of the coin is that if you're always worried about doing things at the perfect time, which I guess I did after a while, having had the odd failure like that actually can mean you don't even try to do anything, because you've never actually got time, or it's never the perfect time, or it's not convenient, or you've got to go somewhere or whatever, and you end up not doing anything. So my challenge is still to say to myself, yeah, look, it's not the perfect time. So I guess the challenge is to try to overcome the fear of doing things at the wrong time, and just get out and do things, when you do have the time, and just have a go, and don't be too caught up in the rules of biodynamics, and just get out there and do what you can, because it's still going to be better than doing nothing at all, because it's not the perfect time.
Yeah. Is there ever a particularly perfect time? And just intriguing to hear that story of the starlings with so many different points hanging off it. One thing I've just taken out of that is, I was hearing about your innovative experimental mindset. You were trying something new whilst not even being entirely convinced of its effectiveness to start with. That ability to suspend disbelief, because a number of people wouldn't have suspended disbelief. They wouldn't have got to that point. So that idea that you pushing yourself a little bit further in order to run an experiment, and also trying to find that purest practical balance, if that's the way to put it, between the purest principles on the one hand of biodynamic methods, but also what is practical, on the other, what can you actually work with on a day-to-day basis, trying to get that balance right. But again, I also heard you were continuing to tap into the old wisdom coming up from Steiner and the grassroots of biodynamic practice. For instance, that peppering process, that sounded to me as a layperson as a sort of another inoculation preparation process. It seemed to be in line with the idea of the minute dilution of materials that nonetheless have disproportionate effects because of the intentional energies that are put into them, and the wider scale cosmic forces acting to sort of energize them in effect. For instance, as you were noticing, the results of the pepper preparations when they were applied in line with accurate biodynamic calendar guidelines.
But yeah, Andrew, if I could just jump in there, because it's not really even limited to those sorts of practices. Like, it takes me back to John Hodgkinson coming out to Rosnay a few years ago with a group, might have been a workshop, and we stood as a group, and at that time we were getting nailed by cockatoos. So, I mean, these are natives, so I would never do a peppering of native species. I think that might be bad karma. But basically, John had a view that, if we all stand together here and we just nicely ask these cockatoos to go down the river and leave our olive trees alone, stop going in there and just basically chewing them to bits just for fun, which is all they were doing. They were just snapping twigs off, and you'd walk through the grove and there's twigs all over the ground. They're just being a pest. And, it actually worked. These cockatoos left us alone for a few days. That was amazing. And I've got an Indigenous friend as well who came, and she was on the farm, and she's going, you talk to the boss. She's talking about the big kangaroos, the eastern greys. There's heaps of them on the farm, and she's like, they're the boss. Well, they're not the only boss. There's also other bosses, but you just talk to these guys and tell them what you want, and sort of put your intention into the land. So, I mean, that side of things, I haven't really gone down the path very far, but yeah, it's certainly, there's no reason to discount these things or say they're impossible. I really think you've just got to have that open mind to at least see if you can see a difference.
And that intriguing story about those cockatoos and on your property, and John Hodgkinson, who you've just mentioned, and he's another guest in the series, and we'll be talking to John, and his interview will be available so that people can hear his biodynamic insights. But again, I just love that idea of a dialogue taking place, a conversation, a sort of conversation with the animals, with the birds, perhaps going back to an understanding in some shape or form that there is a deep connection between ourselves and the other species, be they plant or animal, with which we share the earth, if only we could more often listen and tap into that undeniable connection. For instance, that at the genetic level, it's absolutely solid, scientifically demonstrated fact that connection is there. But, can we find other ways of tapping into it? In another episode of this series, a fruit grower down in South Australia describes having a sort of dialogue, a sort of conversation with his fruit trees, his cherry trees, in terms of the black spot fungus infestation that they're encountering down there. And he's been trying to work out, in communication with the trees, how best to deal with that. So as a layperson listening to this, but with an understanding going back a long ways because of my environmental science background, that holism principle, that everything is connected to everything else, it seems to me that these stories, anecdotes point to that almost being taken to a gold standard within biodynamic practice. That's how it appears to me, it seems to me.
Yeah, it's kind of everything is totally connected, and it's only our minds that are sort of creating limitation artificially. Yeah, well, you wonder. Anyway,
I couldn't agree more. And now, as we move through this interview towards the end, Sam, it's time to shift the focus one last time to the future, specifically to the future for you and your farm there. So, as we come to the end of this very thought-provoking interview, what does the future hold for you, your family, and Rosnay property down there?
Okay, well, I mean, I have no plans of leaving. I feel very blessed to live here, and with my wife as well. She loves it here, and my parents love it here. What's the next generation going to do? I guess that's always a question, and you can't make them do anything. And I mean, my kids no doubt see that there's a lot of work involved in running a farm like this, and they might think that they'd be better off doing something else, and fair enough. And I hope they go out into the wider world and succeed at their own thing. But if they ever wanted to come back, or even if they don't, they can always call this place home. And I just think to be able to work in a family business is a real blessing. And I'd like to continue doing that any way we can. But we also are part of this community. And so whatever happens, I feel like our future is assured because we've got these beautiful neighbours and the community farm that we're part of. There's this social ecosystem. There's skills and talents and people's abilities, and we work together in so many different ways that I'm not worried about the future. I think whatever happens, we'll be right through family and through community. So I'm optimistic, and I don't listen to the radio too much these days. I'm just trying to stay optimistic, and I think we'll be fine.
Sam, you mentioned a community connection there, and as mentioned in the introduction, there is a community title set up you have down there on Rosnay or near Rosnay, a covenant of growers arrangement. Do you want to say a bit more about that? I've heard from other guests in the series there is often a great importance attaching to community approaches and benefits of biodynamic growing. So do you want to say a bit more about your particular setup there?
Yeah, I'd love to. Well, we're part of a community title subdivision of a farm that was originally 140 hectares, 340 acres, into 12 blocks, 12 farm blocks. And because there was already 2 houses on the farm, where we had an additional 10 house blocks. So basically all the farm blocks have a house block. It's like having a unit in a block of flats, except it's on flat ground. It's, instead of an elevator, we've got an irrigation system. Instead of gardens around the building, we've got common land, which is all areas with biodiversity and trees and stuff in between all the production areas. And it took 5 years or so, but that concept suddenly took off, and we've just got these most fantastic neighbours now who are part of the Rivers Road Organic Farms scheme or community, and doing different things. So no one's really beholden to each other. It's the aim of the subdivision is for everyone to be self-reliant and viable as farmers. And so, that's an important point, is that we're a farm. We're not like a suburban development. And so, all your sort of activities are focused on being viable farmers and also being organic. So that was another big one. So all the different blocks have to maintain their organic certification. And that keeps us together as well. It gives us a common sort of thread, a common goal. And the types of people who've come here have been right into that sort of organic farming, biodynamics, natural living, permaculture, natural buildings. And we're all getting on really well, and we actually work constructively together quite well. So it's been a fantastic thing to be part of, and it gives me hope for the future.
So wonderful to hear that whole idea of communal cooperation, the sharing of knowledge, the sharing of energies, possibility of developing multi-perspective responses to dealing with future challenges. As in other areas of society, given the interlinked challenges we're facing environmentally, economically, and socially, one would think it would be a no-brainer. But unfortunately, such community approaches don't occur anywhere near as often as they should do. I would have thought, the coming together of groups of people in alliance, in community, or however you might describe it, to deal with challenges, to come up with fresh ideas, to be more innovative. It just seems so obvious. It's just a shame that we don't seem to be able to apply that community alliance idea at a wider scale throughout society more generally.
I mean, it goes against the whole "I'm the king of my castle" mentality of total private ownership. But if there's anyone out there, any farmers out there with a farm that's that they're keen to do something with, they should come and visit us and talk to some of us and see what we've done here. And I'd love to help someone do something similar.
Well, that leads nicely into the last couple of questions as we round off this excellent interview. You've just given us a bit of advice there on community approaches and cooperation in growing practice. But do you have any other specific parting advice for those who might be wanting to know more about biodynamics, growers going down that path, or people coming to the subject for the very first time? Where could they or should they start?
I think it's a matter of, I guess, as I said before, you sort of just have a go, just do a bit in your own garden, even read up about it, meet some other growers, get some 500 in your hands and smell it and squeeze it and try to just get a feel for it and put it out in your garden and see if you notice any difference. And so it's just kind of like small steps and just have a go rather than being too skeptical. Like, it's good to be skeptical, but it's also good just to have a go and be open to unexpected results. So yeah, I don't really know what other advice to give except just have a go.
And Sam, that sounds a bit like a response to the very last question I was going to ask you. But to give you one last opportunity, in addition to that very nice short take-home message of have a go and get on with it in the most positive and nice sense, do you have any other short take-home messages for listeners which could help them get a handle on your ideas?
I mean, Biodynamic Agriculture Australia is, the old Farming and Gardening Association. They're the ones who've brought us all together and, putting this podcast together. I really have to recommend subscribing to their email newsletters, getting their news leaf, printed newsletter, going to their events. I think there's a biodynamic group in Sydney. Maybe join that. There's plenty of ways to connect up these days with the internet and all that stuff. So I just think, when we started out, me and Dad, that was a key approach, was to go to biodynamic conferences, down in the Hunter Valley or wherever, and meet other growers and just network a bit and meet people. So I guess that's the key message there, and that's the great thing about the BAA.
So finally, this is a brilliant place to wrap up the interview, Sam. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk with you today. I know you've given our audience a lot of thought-provoking ideas which can help their own next steps towards getting into biodynamics or applying biodynamic growing methods, and taken from some of the fascinating and environmentally protective approaches to growing you have described. Along with other guests in the series, your unique story today has given us great examples of the important ability of biodynamics to regenerate soil, supercharge organic growing, restore biodiversity, and work with Mother Nature. And so, Sam, sadly, it's time to say goodbye. On behalf of both the podcast production and support organisations which made this interview possible, they are Hope Incorporated Australia and Biodynamic Agriculture Australia Limited, I want to thank you so very much for our conversation today.
My pleasure. Thanks, Andrew. Yes, and thanks to Hope for putting it together as well. It's been a pleasure.
You've been listening to an episode in the podcast series Biodynamic Farmers and Gardeners in Australia. The series was produced by Householders Options to Protect the Environment, Hope Incorporated Australia, with the generous funding support of Biodynamic Agriculture Australia Limited. It has been a pleasure to help raise awareness of some of the environmentally protective values of biodynamic growing practice in its ability to regenerate the biological health of soil, supercharge organic growing, restore biodiversity, and work in harmony with Mother Nature. Please consult the episode show notes for possible follow-up material on topics discussed in interview and any relevant contact details should you wish to respond to anything you have heard. And if you enjoyed the episode, please consider promoting it across your networks and giving it a positive rating in your preferred podcast app. You can also give us feedback via the short 5-minute online survey using the link also available in the show notes. My name is Andrew Nicholson, producer of the series, and thank you for listening.